All right, we are live. Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Siska, Executive Director of the Chicago Justice Project, and also your host for our Facebook Live series. Today, we welcome Paul Vallas, former CEO of the Chicago Public Schools. He's had a variety of those types of positions around the country, and now he's back in Chicago. Most recently ran for mayor against Lori Lightfoot and a slew of others. Paul, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we're going to focus a lot on policing. You've done a lot of posting to social media. There's some things I want to chat about related to that. But you've also, you talk a lot about politics. So I want to get a couple definitions out of you if I can. Okay. How would you define? We talk a lot about it in the city, but I want a definition. How would you define the machine, the political machine in Chicago? What is that?
Well, I mean, if you can even define it, as the last couple races have demonstrated, the machine is not what it used to be. Let me just say, instead of defining the machine, let's talk about government in Chicago. Chicago is one of the few remaining cities that literally has a local government almost completely dominated by the mayor. And if you look at other major cities, it's simply not the case. So the city councils, the respective city councils, are much more powerful, much more influential, and in many cases, they have the capacity for what I call independent thought. That means they are able to access information and analyze it. So they really have the resources they need to be a co-equal branch of government, and we don't have that here. So all the decisions and bad decisions that you've seen happen. The underfunding of pensions, the pension holidays that the mayor's office pursued, the selling of the Skyway and the parking meters, the cover-up of the Laquan McDonald, what I call the disorganization of the police department. Those are all decisions that have emanated from City Hall with very little city council input. So what we really have is we have a I don't know, is it called unicameral or whatever? We have one branch that is exceedingly dominant, and the other branch that simply does not have the capacity, or for that matter, the will to challenge the mayor's office. And that's just not with Lightfoot. She's just continuing the tradition of past mayors for probably the last 5 decades.
It's one of the things I don't think people understand who are not involved in trying to get legislation passed in the city. I was part of a group that helped pass police board reform when Rahm first came into office, and then in his later years helped him create COPA and the Deputy Public Safety Inspector General's office. And in both of those pushes, that basically passed the city council in the corporation council's office. I remember a meeting years ago with Felicia Davis when Rahm first got in. We were in the corp council's office, 2 intergovernmental affairs lackeys, the patronage people. And at the end of the meeting, you get this little lackey says, okay, it'll pass police and fire next Wednesday, and it'll pass the city council the week after. And I look around, I'm like, hey, there's no alderman in this, but it passed. And Felicia Davis laughed and said, that's how it's done.
That's right.
And one of my colleagues said, well, should we inform the chairman, which was Balser at the time, about what's happening? And she goes, no, don't worry, we'll inform him. And that was the definitive proof we needed that it all resides on the 5th floor, and almost nothing matters outside of it.
Kind of like the way Putin treats the Duma.
Yeah, right. It was astounding.
Yeah, the Duma will pass this on Wednesday.
Right, and that was. Go ahead.
They do everything but short. I've always said that the governmental system in Chicago so much reflects the old Soviet system. Remember, the old man Daley was the chairman of the party and the head of the government. Khrushchev was the chairman of the party and the head of the government. So I always laughed. I said, they mirror that system. The only thing that they don't do is they don't assassinate their opponents. They politically assassinate their opponents, but they don't physically assassinate them.
Right. No, that is exactly it. It just astounds me how little, from most aldermen, how little movement there is in anything unless they get the okay from the 5th floor to move. At least that was my experience under Rahm and before him.
Yeah, absolutely. And the real tragedy there is, by at least if you look at the way it's structured, It should be a weak mayor, strong city council government, but it isn't, because the city council in many ways have simply abdicated their responsibilities. Now, maybe too many aldermen have gotten comfortable with their big salaries and their big office allowances and their little patronage armies, and the fact that despite the so-called council reforms, still have a lot of discretion over what goes on in their awards. But at the end of the day, they have the power to assert themselves. I mean, they could create an independent budget office that would have all the tools like other budget offices do to really challenge the mayor, and they could demand the release of information or hold up her legislation to make sure that they had all the data that they would need to make informed judgments. But they have elected not to do that. There are some who are fighting for that, but the balance of the council remains docile, unfortunately.
Yeah, the parking meter deal should be, there's nothing you can do about the past, but that should have been the wake-up call for the city council.
Yes.
That was such an unprecedented disaster.
And that huge contractor deal was just plopped on their desks at the last minute. I mean, you've seen that done at the state legislative level too, particularly with the demise of the kind of the proportional representation. If you remember, Quinn's resolution that really removed opposition from the state legislature. And I remember working for the state legislature. I worked, of course, for the late, great Senate President Phil Rock, who was much more democratic than his House counterparts. But I remember legislation being plopped on the desk, like conference committee reports that were 800 pages thick, like minutes before the bewitching hour, which is noon on June 30th, and when you have the last time to vote where you don't need an extraordinary majority. But the council has just gotten weaker and weaker, and despite some grumblings, they still have not asserted themselves. Has the mayor lost a vote? I mean, so at the end of the day, they have the capacity to challenge her, but or whoever is mayor, but they simply refuse to do so.
Yeah, and it's astounding to me. I want to get off the city council after this, but it really is astounding to me how little repercussions they feel for the votes that impacted their awards. The economic disparity, the economic desert that is the south and west sides of Chicago. These votes from these aldermen that have been in forever have allowed that to happen with little or no resistance, and they feel no repercussions. They just keep getting reelected time after time after time.
If they don't get indicted.
Yes. Well, yes. And I think there's always rumors swirling around City Hall about who's being investigated and how many. I'm not going to mention any, but I know I've heard of 3 or 4. I mean, the ongoing what's going on out of Pilsen and stuff with Madigan, but in Chinatown, but I've heard of more going. Who knows if it's ever going to come to fruition. Okay, one more citywide question before we get on the police. You're quite outspoken on social media about issues that you feel are important. So I want to bring up some of them for this discussion. One of them being, it's at least in your writing, you talk about why the pandemic wasn't a seismic disruption for city finances. I was wondering if I could get you to talk a little more about what you.
Oh no, what I said is in April I did an op-ed piece in the Tribune that the mayor disparaged me on, basically saying the pandemic's going to have a huge impact on city finances and they need to prepare. I referred to they need to design a code red budget, and I actually identified a number of things that they could do immediately, including some creative things to do with TIFs to maximize the TIF surpluses, to help build up the cash reserves right now. And of course, I got criticized for it. What I said was the mayor, when she announced, of course, surprise, surprise, that we have a $2 billion structural deficit over this year and next, and incidentally, I believe it's going to be larger. She said it was COVID had caused a seismic event or a seismic disruption. And I pointed out that the type of seismic disruption that implies that it was like a sudden event. And I said, earthquakes are summer events, are sudden events. I said I would equate this geological event to a slow simmering volcano were like Pompeii. You knew that volcano was going to erupt, and you just failed to take action. So that was my reference to that, to my geological kind of like crossing swords on that. I mean, the city knew that this was coming, and the city didn't prepare for it. And that's why things are significantly worse now financially than they would have been had they begun making preparations in April, like many other cities and many other states did.
Okay, I want to get your take since you mentioned TIFs. I can't, as a, well, I'm in DC now, but I was a taxpayer. I still own a condo in Chicago, my wife. I've never understood the financial or the economic, how TIFs don't affect the economic stability of the city. I think.
I have to interrupt you for 1 second,
No
Paul. Gus? Yeah. My keys are on my, check my desk. I mean my cabinet in my room, okay? All right, thanks. My son is visiting from San Antonio, and he was looking for his keys, and he's been doing it for the last 20 minutes, so I apologize to all your listeners.
No problem. It's a welcome to COVID. But TIFs, I don't understand, like, for me, any real economic justice that's going to bring about real economic justice in the south and west sides of the city have to deal with TIFs. I remember David Orr, his last report was he published in 2018, said the city collected $660 million in TIFs. Now that number has gone up.
It's $926 million this last year.
Right. It's like, wait a minute. How like, where are you, city council, to keep letting that slush fund exist? So I just wanted to get your feelings on a little more on TIFs.
Well, let me just tell you, the TIF, in theory, TIFs are designed to, you go into a blighted area, you in effect lay out a plan to develop that area, and then you go out and borrow, and the money that comes from tax revenue being generated from that blighted area that was not generated before can finance the investments that are going to be made to make the area to address the issue of blight. That's what it's supposed to be done. That's the way it's supposed to work theoretically, but that's not the way it works. Few blighted areas really experience any real development because you don't see the investment. What they've done is they've carved TIFs out of the South Loop, the North Loop, the Lincoln Yards TIF. I mean, in some cases, they've created TIFs in areas that in some of the few areas in the city that have been experienced increases in property values and thus increases in tax revenue. So what they're doing is by doing that, what they're doing is they're diverting that money. They're diverting that money off the top. When they create a tax increment financing district and and that district is already generating increasing property taxes every year, and they take that money away, your taxes actually go up. So when they say they're diverting $926 million in TIFs, what they've in fact done is raise your property taxes a like amount because local governments get what they levy. In other words, the local governments, if the city wants to increase its property tax levy by 5%, they get that net of TIFs. So the more revenue growth money you take away, the higher your property tax go, because you're not only paying for the schools and the cities' annual increases in your property tax levy, you're also paying for the diversion of the monies that are going to the TIF fund. And that $926 million last year is like a slush fund. The mayor has almost total control on how that money is spent and allocated. And there was a study that was done in 2015 that was not, obviously it was not updated, that showed like on the south and west side, only like 4 to 5% of the money from the TIFs had actually been spent on projects in those areas. So the bottom line is that it never delivered on its promise, and it was never used as it was designed to do. That does not mean that using TIFs to do infrastructure investments, and they designed a TIF to help with a lot of the CTA infrastructure, does not suggest those type of things are not sound, but they have not used TIF revenues to develop those long neglected areas of the city. And as a result, you've only really seen development in the city in about maybe 10 of the 50 wards. And in like 4 of the 50 wards, half the city's development has occurred. So you've got areas on the south side and west side that have been disinvested in. And You see it in the exodus of the middle class. In 1970, when I was in college, by the way, showing you my age, 50% of the city was middle income. WBEZ report came out and said today it's 15%. And when you take the mandatory city residence requirements for, it's probably in the single digits. So we've gone from half the city being middle class to barely a sixth of the city being middle class. And that is not a healthy situation. And since 2000, I think the number was, well, over 250,000 African-American, middle-income African-Americans have left the city. So the exodus is an exodus of largely middle-income and upper-income residents, which is destabilizing the communities because we've really become the tale of two cities. The majority of the city being very, very poor, and a section of the city being more affluent. And unfortunately, you're seeing the results of that disinvestment. There's been I call them the preconditions for violence in the community, and we just simply have not. We've simply failed to address those issues.
Right. No, I 100% agree with you. I also would challenge politicians. I think we have had a long tradition, started with Daley and maybe even before him, of addressing a blighted area by seeking investment, but also gentrification. So it isn't that we're uplifting the South Loop. When I was a kid, it wasn't a very nice area to go into, right? It didn't have $3,000 condos, right? $3,000 a month rents. You didn't go there. Now, why did people go there? Because they didn't, when that community changed, it didn't change for the residents that were there. They left. So all you've done is destabilize them. They move into communities, they don't know anyone. There's less community cohesion, and that just keeps happening and happening and happening. And that you're basically dooming those communities that are left.
That's right. That's right. They do nothing to protect the existing residents, those residents on fixed income, low income residents, or for that matter, seniors. They don't. Look, I mean, there was a strategy. I remember when I was city budget director, I mean, I felt that the city's strategy was, particularly when it came to the CHA, and this man on the CHA, was to force poor people to the suburbs. It was really interesting because it had an effect of turning the suburban districts that had been, not exclusively Democrat. And so the city was getting rid of its poor people, and more suburban districts that at one time had voted Republican were suddenly voting Democrat. But the net effect was the destabilizing of those communities created conditions that did not help the schools get better, and they also created conditions of their failure to address the lack of quality schools, the lack of jobs, the lack of economic opportunities. Obviously, higher crime, that in turn has, and inadequate schools has driven the middle class out of those communities. So you have communities now that are, I mean, when you go to the Rosen community, half the men are in some phase of the criminal justice system. I mean, this isn't me speaking. This is people from the community telling me that. I mean, you have widespread unemployment. You have generational unemployment. The city simply hasn't made the investments. And despite, in the Rosen community in particular, Alderman Beal, working night and day to advance and to bring investment to the community. And he's had a lot of success doing that. Unfortunately, look, and it's just not predominantly minority wards. Look at the Hegewisch. I mean, look at the far south side, I mean, we're still waiting for them to clean up the mess left by all the industry that's vacated. I mean, there's a life expectancy difference in this city that's as great as 30 years. In certain communities, the life expectancy is like in the early in your early 60s. In other communities, it's in your late 80s. This is like the difference between the life expectancy in Germany and in Russia. I mean, so what does that tell you? It's just not. Those numbers are it's less because there's a spike in violence and more because people are living in unhealthy communities. The food deserts, pollutions, lead in the water, manganese in the soil and things like that. So, and the city hasn't done anything to invest, despite the fact that they are now diverting close to over $900 million a year in our property taxes for development that is going to do virtually nothing to help these poor, long neglected, generational neglected communities, unfortunately.
Yeah, yes. I remember going to Alderman Beal's office in his ward some years ago when we were talking to him about police board reform when he was head of the police and fire for a short period of time. And you ride around and you just see some of it looks like prairie,
right?
Because everything's been knocked down. And what is standing is just one desolate remnant of a factory after another, after more prairie. And it's like, it would be, to me, I had never really been in Detroit, but what you hear of Detroit and what it conjures in your mind, you think like, oh, wow, this must be how Detroit looks.
Yes.
And at the same time, you're looking at a city that's got cranes all over the place in the loop and in the South Loop. And even though I have my issues with Alderman Fioretti at the moment, or former Alderman Fioretti, over a whole range of issues, when he first ran, he said he talked to construction people in his ward because he walked the entire ward. And every time he went to talk to them, none of them lived in the city.
Yeah.
And to me, I always took that as, wow. And I asked him, how much of that is TIF money? He goes, all these projects are TIF.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why are we paying for people to drive up from Kankakee to work? If we're going to use city money to subsidize these things, they ought to employ Chicago people.
Well, during the campaign, I did a series of issue papers that I put out. And you know the joke. I think Cass says every time Vallas opens his mouth, a white paper comes out. Yes, guilty as charged. And if you see my Facebook posts, obviously there's no one editing me for length.
I've seen them.
Whatever. It is what it is. But the point is, I talked at length about, when we were in the Chicago public schools, because the schools were on the verge of collapse, when I became superintendent, I almost had like unilateral authority over the schools. I had a supportive board. I worked very closely with Gary Chico. So when we did our school construction program, we opened 78 buildings and renovated 350, and 90% of them were in the poorest communities. So we went into every poor community, tore down the prefab schools, and replaced them with brick and mortar schools. And in Roseland, a community where I grew up, I went to Curtis and Infighter High School before we moved. I bought the soon-to-be abandoned Mendel or St. Martin de Porres 40-acre campus, and I built Southside College Prep. I mean, up until when Beal became alderman, that was probably the only investment in that community in 30 or 40 years. And I remember, I mean, Michigan Avenue was like an outdoor shopping mall. I mean, you had everything on Michigan Avenue. What do you have on Michigan Avenue now? I mean, burnt out stores, or maybe, maybe a couple fast food places. And I mean, it's a desolate. You have, and it's just 10 miles away from the Gold Coast, or the Gold Coast, which unfortunately has been under siege. But at the end of the day, clearly the city has simply not made the effort to invest in the communities. And it does not have to be that way. If the city wanted to right now, they could go out, issue bonds, amortize the interest, and finance those bonds with TIF revenues that will come available, property tax revenues that will come available when the existing TIF districts expire. And they could raise billions of dollars that they could use to do environmental cleanup, to get lead out of the water, to do affordable housing, to go in and to basically do the streetscaping, to provide the infrastructure supports, to encourage real investments in those communities. But there's both a combination of lack of imagination and lack of will. So unfortunately, I don't see any deviation. I don't see any dramatic TIF reforms. Do you? Lincoln Yards is still full speed ahead. I mean, I don't see any TIF fair sharing. The mayor has an initiative that purports to put $750 million into the south sides and west sides, but what they don't tell you is about two-thirds of that money was stuff that Rahm Emanuel already planned, and it includes the big infrastructure investments and on the transportation investments that the CTA was planning on undertaking. And I'm not suggesting that she and the city council are not motivated to do something, but what they need to do is they need to do something dramatic And I just don't see the sacred cows like TIFs and programs like that being touched. You know, they're almost sacrosanct. It's almost as if the mayor's office wants to continue to control close to $1 billion that they can determine how that money's allocated on an annual basis, almost independent from serious deep down city council review. And unfortunately, the neighborhoods that are most in need are going to continue to be most neglected.
Right. I mean, we have sowed the seeds of what the city's dealing with and has been dealing with related to violence. I would say decades ago. That's when the seeds were planted. And the more we have sucked out resources, Daley's closing of mental health clinics,
yes,
Rahm Emanuel's closing of schools in generally the same areas where the kids, the report from the University of Chicago's kids went to equally bad performing schools or worse, the vast majority. That was a total money grab. All of this sets the preconditions where you're going to have violence because you're just basically starving people. And something is going to happen from that. And then for me, you add on a pandemic, you add on massive unemployment, and there's the powder keg that was basically like kind of like a nuclear bomb on top of the powder keg that was already existing.
Yeah, it's like the perfect storm.
It is, and it's the perfect storm, but we can get to that in a minute. I'm sick and tired of not seeing accountability put on the people that it needs to be put on. Where is our city council? Where are the aldermen from these poorest wards? What have they done?
You know, the irony is, and I've posted this stuff before, and I'm going to post it again. And I also post on LinkedIn. So if people want to look at my posts, Paul Vallas, I have a public Facebook, and then you can find my posts on LinkedIn. And, you know, I put together a list of 15 things that the city unilaterally can do that would have a impact in the community, a real impact in the community that's not going to unbalance your budget. And you know, I mean, because it's not, look, we're in a deep financial crisis that we're going to have to address, but there are still things that we can do when it comes to the utilization, allocation, of resources that can have a dramatic impact. Just to name a few of those things. I mean, dedicating a third of all TIF revenues, of all new TIF revenues in cannabis and casino and gaming and sports betting revenues to a neighborhood revitalization fund that focuses on the west side and the south side, particularly those areas that have the opportunity zone federal tax incentives. You could generate billions of investment in those communities, doing what I articulated by issuing bonds, amortizing interest, and financing those bonds from future property tax revenues that will become available when the TIFs expire. Something I did in Philadelphia, where I raised almost $2 billion to renovate the schools without raising property taxes. You could raise billions that you could then use to provide affordable housing, to do major environmental remediation, which is in some cases a precondition for new investment. Doing what you pointed out, when I ran the Chicago Public Schools, we did $3.2 billion in school construction. We mandated that half the contracts go to Black and Latino businesses, and that half of those hired be Black and Latino, and half of those hired be city residents. And you know what? We exceeded all those numbers. $1.8 billion in salaries went to Black and Latino workers. $1.76 billion in salaries went to city residents. What if you applied that same model, buy Chicago, hire Chicago, sell Chicago, to the $22 billion in budgets that the mayor's office actually controls? She not only controls the $11 billion plus city budget, she controls the $8.4 billion school budget, the CTA, the CHA, water, sewer, aviation, the park district, etc. So the point is, I mean, what if you spent $22 billion by prioritizing the contracting with city businesses, doing target marketing with minority businesses, and the hiring, of people from the community? Believe it or not, contractors found a way to find enough construction workers who are Black and Latino to exceed the 50% requirement. 56%, or was it 58%, of all of those hired for the building of 78 schools and the renovations of 350 schools were Black and Latino and women. How did that happen? So where there's a will, there's a way. So those are things that don't cost the city money. Or doing something as simple as, and I did this with my work for the Sally Yates and the Justice Department on adult ed occupational training reform in the federal prison system. I used the same team, and we actually looked at the plight of those previously incarcerated and how they lack all sorts of educational occupational training opportunities. So we went back and we inventoried all the adult ed occupational training programs that are out there and support services that are out there. And there's like 40 different programs and 24 different support agencies, none of whom communicate with each other, few of whom get the funding that they need. So you almost have a network of providers that can help this displaced population get educated and get connected to jobs. In fact, the federal government will give you a $8,000 training grant for someone who was previously incarcerated or has been long-term unemployed, or for that matter, a dropout, to occupationally train them. And then if you hire them, they will give you a $9,700 tax credit after 120 hours on the job to the business that hires them. Where's the coordinated effort to put these individuals back to work, or to remove the obstacles to those previously incarcerated who have not committed violent crimes to have an opportunity to get jobs, their records wiped clean, not only get jobs, fill vacancies in the city, but fill vacancies with companies that contract out with the city. They're almost like, it's like the night of the living dead. You know what I mean? They're displaced in their own community with no opportunities, despite the fact that they've served their time. These are no-brainer things. These are things that you can do. These are things that you can do unilaterally, you see? But yet there's an unwillingness to do that.
That's true. And that's what I said about TIFs. You know, Lori did for this last budget surplus a certain, I'm going to say small amount, but I think it was like 40 or $60 million, maybe $80 million. And that's great. And it shows this movement, but it's like that pen can do a lot more.
Yes.
But also one last thing on TIFs, I've always thought, I'm sorry, we're going to give your building, like building that stadium, whatever it is over by McCormick Place, we gave them $100 million or whatever, $200 million.
Oh yeah, okay. The center, the Wintrust Center.
Wintrust Center. Okay. Well, like $200 million? Well, now half the people that work on this have to be from Chicago. Oh, you can't find enough? Great. Then you're going to train. You're going to train on 200 or 500 individuals with our money. You're going to train them on this job. So they get a union card. If you give that money, if you set the market, it's kind of like Trump with the PPE, right?
Yeah.
You want the PPE, set the market. You will pay them so much per every individual from these zip codes, meaning these demographics, that they will train. You will give them so much money to train them. You set that market, they will come.
Do that. Incidentally, these reports are posted and they're online. There was the 2002 assessment of the capital program in Chicago, $3.2 billion. Incidentally, we also did the set-asides for the high targets for hiring architectural firms, professional services, law firms. Even the bond councils had to have MBEW requirement. We were that obsessed. But the point is, how did we do it? We built 78 schools in 6 years and renovated major renovations in 350, minor renovations exceeding 3,000. And you know what? We built Walter Payton for $25 million. And 2 years after we left, and they went back to the old ways of doing things, they built Jones for $125 million without doing RMBWB. What's wrong with that picture? So anyone
it's
who
so very Chicago of them.
Anyone who says that when you don't expand opportunities for minority businesses, Black and Latino-owned businesses, somehow you're diluting. You're not diluting. We created so much competition that we controlled the market, that we were able to get good prices. We were able to get contracts done on time with minimum change orders. You see, we created competition. The city could do that with all of its city agencies. And that doesn't require new taxes or new programs. Just pumping billions of dollars into minority and women-owned businesses and spending billions of dollars hiring minority workers through the city agencies, through construction contracts and things like that. That can have a catalytic event. In fact, we did target marketing where we targeted exclusively Black businesses for small school technology purchases so we could begin developing an industry of Black business technology providers, like all contracts under $10,000. And we did that. So we selected various things where we could legally do target marketing. We created so much work for everybody. Nobody complained. We paid prevailing wage. That was our only requirement with the unions. They were supportive because we went from a $600 million capital plan to a $3 billion capital plan. I said, you can either have all of $600 million or you could have half of $3 billion. You decide what you want to do. So where there's a will, there's a way, but there's a lack of imagination. And what I try to do through my posts, and I'm going to continue to do, is to try to reintroduce these ideas out there. You know, and look, I have a bone to pick with the Chicago Teachers Union and the closing of schools, which I think is going to have a catastrophic impact on children. I mean, you realize that being closed now through November, it will have been, what is that, 8 months, almost 8 months, mid-November, that kids have not been in school. The poor children are not social distancing at home. Only 1/6 of Black and brown families have the capacity to work remotely. This is devastating. This is devastating these communities. I don't care what anybody says. You know, they needed to have a better plan, and they needed to be more willing to be accommodating. So, and I'm a firm believer that you need to give poor children educational choices. You know, the big mistake that they made was not trying to improve schools in the neighborhoods. It was closing those schools or not replacing those failing models with better models. There are programs, they call them the Renaissance schools in Camden, and in Indianapolis, they call them the Camden schools. In the innovation schools in Denver. And what they do is the community, they go into their neighborhood schools where these schools are failing, and working with the community, they select a better school operator. I'm talking about a not-for-profit school operator to improve the quality of that local school. And they've done it with great success. But the teachers union here, they want to cap charters. They don't want you to replicate high-performing, nonprofit charter school models. They want to limit children's choices. They want more money.
Oh no.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
They want more money for the schools, but they don't want to expand educational opportunities for the kids. And when you do that, you know, when it's all about, we're going to give the schools more money, but we're not going to give you more school choices. What you're really doing is it's kind of the new version of separate but equal. And when the quality of your school is determined by your zip code, and because you're poor, you don't have the capacity to select any other educational options, and you can't get into the magnet schools because they have limited capacity. And sometimes I have to question about how the whole selection process to the magnet schools, because we set very specific targets to make sure that all those schools were racially diverse. Well, when you do that, what you're doing is it's like education redlining. I mean, people are confined. People are limited in their educational options, or they have no educational options short of their failing school. They have no recourse. But yet those are things that do not require a new investment of funds. They just require a new attitude and a change in policy. So much of what ails the city is financial, but also much of what ails the city is the lack of priorities. And I think you've hounded on it. You've certainly pointed out when it comes to the creme de la creme of the city diverting money from communities in need so that they can spend it on their political priorities. The TIF, there's no better example than the abuse of the public trust and of the public funds in the tax increment financing program.
Right. I mean, you can't close all those mental health clinics, and you can't close all those schools and not feel that there's going to be repercussions.
Let me tell you what's happening now with the cannabis. And I talked about this during the campaign. And you know, I ran for mayor because it was clear that Rahm Emanuel, they were trying to orchestrate so that Rahm wouldn't have any challenges. You know, and then of course Rahm got out and 8 other people entered the race. But the bottom line is I also ran because I felt that there needed to be a debate on issues. And I said, beware of them rigging the cannabis allocations, you know, the dispensaries and things like that.
Licenses.
I mean, how many of these dispensaries are going to be community owned? I had said that what the city should have done is the city should have insisted that cannabis is going to be a local industry. all the cannabis dispensaries in Chicago have to be community owned. You know, in Pennsylvania, the state owns the liquor stores. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, let the community own the dispensaries. Let the community grow the cannabis. Create a community industry. Keep the cannabis proceeds in the community to invest in social service infrastructure. What do I mean? Opening mental health centers in every police district. Opioid and drug treatment centers. Yep. Job training centers. You see what I mean? Create a local industry. You know, you want reparations? There's a reparation for it. Making sure that the community has an equity stake in the casinos, like the Indian reservations, so that the money from the casinos are staying in the community, or not just harming people in the community, but those proceeds are being used to invest in the community. Those are, you know, those aren't things that cost. It's just a question of what you're going to prioritize. You know, but I see the dispensaries being, now people are suing because they're criticizing the process. I don't see any, you know, I don't see the minority ownership, the Black ownership, or the Latino ownership in the dispensaries. I don't see where they're growing cannabis in the city. You know, we could promote urban agriculture. We have so much open space. I don't see any efforts to do that. You know, and I'm afraid that they may very well rig the casino process. You know, I've already heard rumors on, you know, you know, it's like, don't be surprised if so-and-so doesn't get the casino license and things like that. So it's, again, so many of these problems in this city are self-inflicted, and it's self-inflicted by the people who are in leadership position.
Well, right. It's all short-term. We're a very short-term society, but we're incredibly short-term thinking in Chicago.
You're so right.
We don't ever make connections. I mean, even Second City Cop Blog, and I hate even mentioning them, right? And I don't mind so much the blog itself, although it has issues. The comments are awful. I mean, if you want to read the worst of the police department, read the comments. That said, even they said that when Daley closed those mental health clinics, what are you doing? You just made our life worse, right? And I think that if we could have a real discussion around, I know everyone rushes to the most extreme definition of defund the police, but if people could take a breath and get a real discussion going about what do we want police officers responding to, right, with a gun. It doesn't mean they don't have to be nearby, but what should show up if a family's having an issue with a family member who's having a mental health issue that is outside of their capabilities? Why in a society, when it isn't imminent violence, why in a society are we only sending these police officers all the time into these houses without a cure, even if they stabilize the situation for a short time? They're not providing a cure. That's not anti-police. That's just reality.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And we don't want to find solutions. We don't want to invest in them. We don't want to have the discussions. We just want cranes up in the loop. We want cranes so that the white rich people feel happy. And, you know, I call it the potted plants. And when people come visit me, when I used to live in Chicago, I would take them outside the potted plant so they could see the real Chicago, as I call it. I'm just aggravated that we're so short term. The schools, the mental health clinics, this has contributed to the violence we're seeing now. We have to make new decisions.
Well, look, you know, one of the things that I advocated for, and I posted on, and I will post again, is on how to build social service infrastructure. Because when you go in and you start investing in, you try to rebuild the social service infrastructure in the communities, you not only address the social service needs, but it's also an economic stimulator. And the idea here isn't for the city to go into the communities and open up mental health clinics. It's for the city to go into the communities and support the creation of locally owned, community-owned mental health centers, drug addiction centers, job training centers, community ownership. We need to create opportunities for community ownership and community wealth, accumulation. And that's not what we do. You know, we hand out money, but we don't invest. So what I said is to build the community infrastructure, you know, so that every community has opioid addiction treatment centers. You know, I lost a son to chronic drug abuse. So firsthand, we've had the experience. And we're an affluent family. We had the wealth and we had the sophisticated, and had the financial resources despite all those obstacles. So, so we could not have imagined how difficult it was for a family without those resources. So at the end of the day, drug treatment, drug training, family counseling, family planning, and I'm not talking about abortion planning. I'm talking about, more family financial planning and things of this nature. Obviously mental health. You use cannabis, you allocate cannabis proceeds, you provide small business loans like you do through the normal small business loan program. So the city's actually investing in these businesses, and then you help them secure Medicaid reimbursements or to get the state reimbursements that are available. Some of the mental health advocates were telling me that how the administration, at least during Rahm's year, dropped the ball on trying to get state and federal reimbursements for the mental health services that they were being provided. So it wasn't just the city wasn't providing the money, the city wasn't going out and recouping the money that they were eligible to recoup. I mean, look, the city's notorious for not reimbursing itself for Medicaid expenses. The Meritorious Credit is trying to get the fire department, or trying to change the rules so the fire department can be more effective. It's like $160 million in Medicaid reimbursements that the city's entitled to that we have never sought. So building that community infrastructure is not cost prohibitive. That should be a budget priority. And, that has to be at the top of your list. So you create you insulate the police, or you create that buffer. In too many communities, the only a public servant that these communities are going to end up interacting with are the police department. I know my son's a firefighter. The EMS calls that the firefighters, just not the EMTs, the emergency medical technicians, but the firefighters have to respond to on a daily basis. So sometimes the only interaction you're going to have with a public official is going to be with either a police officer, or for that matter, somebody who works for the fire department, and that is not what it should be. So the police are victims too.
They are, and
the
that's
police
something.
Are victims too.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that, and I don't think it would be nice if the union could, in my opinion, open their eyes a little bit.
Yeah,
they're prohibiting reforms that could help their members. Mm-hmm. And this is a problem for all unions, and I'm pro-union, but and the FOP is the biggest problem with this, is they fight so hard to protect the worst of them that they give up on what they should be doing for the vast majority of their members.
Right. And that's the same thing with the Chicago Teachers Union too. Look, I'm not against collective bargaining, but there should never be limits to the length of the school day or the length of the school year, or your instructional models. Those things should not be dictated by collective bargaining agreements. I mean, inner city kids need a longer school year. Inner city kids need a longer school day. When I was a superintendent back in the 90s, we kept our schools open until 8 o'clock at night so we could provide kids with 3 meals a day and offer additional instruction, additional support, because the kids needed that additional support to improve academically, and they need to be in safe, secure places. So this isn't an anti-union thing. This is just that they can't be obstacles to real progressive changes that benefit our constituents.
Right, and I will tell you that Rahm was definitely not the guy to do it, because he was a thug and a bully on his best day, right? Mm-hmm. But I have a cousin who's a school teacher who I love dearly, but I told him, because they were talking about, because Rahm tried to extend the day like an hour or whatever that was.
Yeah, I think he got 20 minutes or something like that.
Right, and he goes, well, I think it was 20 minutes of instruction. He goes, well, we're just like babysitters. I'm like, to some degree, yes. And there could have been a better, but Rahm doesn't do things. He was much like Daley. He pulled ahead.
Right.
Plan it. Go to CTU, bring them in and say, listen, we need to find a way to get every kid in programs till 6 o'clock. Right. How do we do this? Do we bring in, and maybe the way is to bring in cut out like music, and I'm not sure what they get of music or art during the day in CPS anymore. Maybe the thing is from after whatever the normal dismissal time is till 6 or 7 or 8, is all the arts and all the sports.
That's right. That's when you get
right.
all
There are ways of doing it and ways of bringing it in and ways of reimbursing some teachers to find help to pay for them to be there longer and bring in people from the outside to do the arts and the music. There are ways of doing that creatively. I agree. I think you want to cut crime, keep kids in school till 6, 7, or 8 o'clock so their families can work, so the adults can work without these kids being unattended, unwatched, out on the street during those hours. We don't want it. We should have massive reinvestment in programs in the summer. We're going to give you, so many hours of, you're going to go to school, summer school or whatever. We're going to pay you for 3 of those hours to give you some money. Yeah. And we're also going to give you this hyper instruction to try to catch up people we need to catch up. There are ways of doing it. We have to make the choice to do it. And for me as a criminologist, that's real crime prevention. I'm talking about crime prevention among everything else.
What we did in the 90s, because we had a great working relationship with the Chicago Teachers Union, the late Tom Reese. And look, when I ran for mayor, I was supported by Debbie Lynch, who succeeded him as Tom Reese. And I actually ran against Tom, arguing that Tom was too soft on me. But yet, Debbie and I have remained great. I have had a great relationship. But what we did was we agreed that we were going to have an extended school day, and it was going to be like a non-traditional day. So when schools would end, we would keep schools open another 2 hours. And kids that were not at grade level or needed additional supports were mandated to stay. And we had, on any given day, 180,000, 200,000 kids, depending on, in those programs, and same amount through the summer. And we could handpick our teachers, and we paid them a flat wage. So we were able to really provide. And what we discovered was many of our younger teachers and newer teachers stayed on, and because they wanted to earn the additional money. And the extended day was totally different. There was 1 hour of intensive instruction designed to address your deficiencies, and then there was a second hour of recreation. And we got the U.S. Department of Agriculture to allow us to provide third meals. And there are things that you can do to make a difference. So this isn't an anti-union thing. We've got to use our resources better and more effectively. Right now, look, schools are closed. Everybody's learning remotely. What are the gym teachers doing? What are the teachers who teach all those electives doing? Are they teaching? Are they online? Are they providing online instruction? If I were superintendent, I would do what Crystal Ray does. Crystal Ray is the Catholic school founded by the Jesuits. Founding Father Foley, first Crystal Ray in Chicago. Now Crystal Ray is in like dozens of other cities, 35 Crystal Ray schools, overwhelmingly minority. What is unique about Crystal Ray? The kids work while they go to school and they earn money. And of course, their money goes to help pay their tuition. But if I were running the schools right now, I would say, fine, you're doing remote instruction. How many hours a day are you going to be on remotely? Clearly, you're not going to get the same amount of instruction you've got when you're. So why not do work study? Why not give every junior and senior an opportunity to substitute work study for non-essential electives? Think about it for a second. You've got over 100,000 city jobs when you include all the agencies that the city controls: schools, parks, etc. CHA, CTA, So the opportunity to create internships in every department and every agency is there. You can require companies that get these big contracts with the city to create and offer internships. You can incentivize businesses to do that. Well, what if all of our kids, 2 hours a day or 3 hours a day, maybe 4 days or 5 days a week, after they got their core studies done, we're in a job, we're in a work environment, kind of an internship of their own choosing, just exposing them to the work world, connecting them with the best role models in the communities, working men and women, getting them in a safe environment will be transformational. You want to get the kids off the street, put a little money in their pocket. And the beauty is, the same money that you would spend providing non-essential electives or electives that aren't even going to be offered now that schools are learning remotely could be the money that could finance this program. So, by reprioritizing 1% of the school district's operating budget, you could create high quality work study programs. So the bottom line is that you have the capacity to do that. And so there's, and then to get the kids engaged. So there are things that you can do that are not going to bust the budget, that are going to have a transformational impact.
Right. And that's going to require leaders on both sides sitting down and thinking more about the communities than themselves and the politics of it. Right.
Yes.
And listen, I don't want to extend the workload of CPS teachers by 50% for no benefit. However, something's got to be done. The more we keep kids off the street and involved, and I think, some of that time after school right now, or when we get back into school, some of it should be technology. Learn how to code, learn how to do things, get these skills that you're going to need to go on to college and for your careers, art, music too. I just think there's so many ways. And I think we have to start talking about these things in a crime prevention way, right? And because all of these things will stop in the end, be a crime preventer. Okay. Well, we talked all about this and none about police, but that's all right. It was a great talk anyways. Everyone, this will be embedded in Facebook. It'll be up on our site tomorrow. It'll be up on YouTube, hopefully by tomorrow. Paul Vallas, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's
my pleasure. I look forward to having an opportunity to visit again.
All right. Take it easy. 1 second.